Thomas, er det greit med talelyd på den her, eller skal jeg bruke en annen i tillegg? Ja. Ja. Litt sånn ord. Ja. Nettopp.
Hva står den på? Ja, det er fint. Hva synes ikke jeg på? Ja.
Ta-dam. Ta-dam, 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 ta-dam. Ta-dam, 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 ta-dam. Bada 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 badum 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 badum. Yep. Ja, fint da. Da prøver vi det. Good.
Jeg virker fullt det i hvert fall nå. Ja. Men da... Ja, det virker jo alle er full, men vi bytter hvis de går til. Minst på. Her er minst på.
Hello, everyone. Um, just just to tell you that I know we are 5 minutes past 9. We should have started, but we are still waiting for some of the actual seminar participants. So please bear with us for 5 more minutes. gjør det klokka 10. Ja. Boom. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for waiting. And welcome everyone to this seminar on cross-adaptive audio processing. At first, I'll just say, welcome here. You have no idea how much when you want to find a welcome poster and you look for like a doormat like this, how much stuff people put on their doormats. There's like welcome, not welcome, does not play well together with others. But hopefully we'll be playing well together here. Few practical details. There's for the researchers and for the assistants, there's some coffee and fruit outside that door if you haven't found it yet. Sorry, it's not for all the students. But you'll manage, I hope. I'm so proud to have this tight-packed program with a lot of expertise from around the world to help us look at this theme of cross-adaptive processing. This is the program for today, and you can see there's different colors. So some sessions are like single presenters, some sessions are performances, and some sessions are more collaborative discursive sessions, which are the blue ones. For those playing tomorrow, we'll have sound checks this afternoon and dinner for the researchers and assistants this evening. Tomorrow there's a similar structure, both days going on till, well, 16:30 today and 16:45 tomorrow. Right. And also for the researchers, there will be lunch coming in the same area as the coffee. Right. Just a few words about where we are in this project. So this project started in May last year and lasts until May next year. So we're sort of 3/4 through, and this seminar will sum up some of our findings and look at some of the interesting problems and things that we have discovered. And there's, in that we are entering the last phase of the project, it's not a whole lot of time to do some completely different things. But in the discussions here, I heartily welcome suggestions, even if they are totally out of the scope of this project, because we'll be doing next projects together. So keep suggestions and comments coming, even though we can't implement all of them in this specific project. Okay, since we also have a lot of students here, and also to sum up where we are for all of our researcher guests, I'll do sort of an introduction to what this project is about and how it works. We have a lot of collaboration partners from universities around the world, and the research is sponsored by the Norwegian Artist Research Program. And we are also very happy to have all these freelancers and musicians in the project. And also that we are directly involving more than 40 of the NTNU students from the jazz department and music technology department, and also IT department, to look into machine learning strategies and such things. Well, what is cross-adaptive processing? Very simply, features from one sound are extracted and they are used to control timbral modulations of another sound. So, in the context of musical activities that lead up to this kind of thing, we have live electronics. Of course, it's improvised performance and contemporary composed music. There's, I mean, we could mention a lot of names. These are some examples of performers and composers that have worked with these related techniques. As it happens, I don't know anyone that have actually done exactly what we're doing here, so we're breaking some new ground also. In terms of technology that we use, the techniques are based on adaptive or digital audio effects, automatic mixing, semantic audio, and you could also look at these techniques as some sort of voice control for software instruments. And all of the analysis that we do are based on music information retrieval, the field of research there. There was a paper on adaptive audio effects back in 2001, so you could say that's a point of departure for this technology. After that, we've had a lot of research on automatic mixing from Josh Rice, who is here, some of his students, and also some more Fasciani, a voice control synthesizer performer, semantic audio here, a lot of stuff. The latest one I discovered is Owen Campbell in Santa Barbara, who also makes cross-adaptive effects. And of course, this whole idea of using some part of one signal to modulate another is commonly used in side chaining compressors. So it's the same technique, same idea. We just expanded it from the amplitude envelope controlling the level of another sound to any feature controlling any other feature. So also in the context of our research here at NTNU, we've done a lot of work on live processing. We had a research project back in 2011, where we looked at how these processing techniques could affect the interplay between performers in the ensemble. And in this process, we have we developed some tools to do sound processing. We have done albums released, and our general workflow is that some sort of artistic idea leads to a technical requirement. So we have to invent some musical tools which we use in performance and then evaluate this, and it goes round and round. Now back to this live processing. I mean, using live processing as an instrumental activity, we have a computer performer and an acoustic performer, and perhaps the sort of it's not a totally even balanced loop between these two. So let's try to, well, the idea of trying to do cross-adaptive processing is to remove this computer musician altogether, bring in another acoustic performer, and maybe make the loop a little bit more even. And you could look at this as a way of creating communion, so working together, or also disturbance, which is just as interesting, I think. It's not just about making instruments that are easily playable and let us control everything at not the tip of our fingers, but the, I don't know, tip of the tongue, maybe. But also to create a hindrance for the habitual interaction that musicians do when we play together. So create difficulties that forces us to do something new. So I think even though the project is heavily technologically based, there's a lot of tools that we need to develop and have developed. The interesting part is the human interaction, how it changes this. So this sound example that I'm about to play is about to become, I don't know, a sort of classic for for me. It was one of the early experiments with Maja, Ratkje and Siv Tjenstad, where we used the vocal amplitude, the envelope follower on the vocals, to reduce the reverb size for the drums. And there's a pretty intense delay on the vocals, and the drums amplitude reduce the feedback amount here. Let's listen to a part. Okay, and let me also add here, at any time, if you have questions or suggestions or objections, please just raise your hand. We'll send the mic around. Do we have an extra mic to send around? Yes. So, any comments on this sound example? Is it easy to hear? Someone think it's hard to hear? Is there a hand up here? No. Okay, everyone thinks this is really easy to follow? Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the input. Right. Okay. I'll just continue talking then. From the previous project where we had this circle of iteration between artistic idea to technical implementation to musical instrument and then to testing it out in practice and going back. We've developed the work methods a little bit more in this project. So of course we develop instruments and tools. We have done more rigid exploration of the practical sessions. A little bit more systematic, and we have added an observer, so a separate role, a person that does nothing but be there and observe, listen, and then take notes and comment, help us figure out what we're actually doing, because a lot of us in such sessions are just occupied with making stuff happen. Andreas will talk more about the documentation, but I wanted to show you one example of a video digest that Andreas creates from sessions. This is our blog, by the way, and this is a report from a session in March this year. And I wanted to show you part of that video.
I liked the last part we did on our last session, where I only played one note in different tempos, and you could really hear different rhythmic things that happened on the saxophone.
It's such a strange, so much going on.
Yeah.
Listening to what she's doing, trying to interpret it, and still play. I just feel like a MIDI keyboard or like a remote control or something.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to focus on what I'm playing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool.
But it's like a two-dimensional way of playing together because
Yeah.
it's a lot of parameters to control. So
Yeah.
it's nice.
You can watch more of these videos online, so please go there. Let's see, where were we? Yeah, so since this is artistic research, it also is it's good to reflect on how is artistic research different from other kinds of research, and how does it differ from scientific research, perhaps. So one of the things that I think qualifies as research is the touching again of the material that we produce in the experimental sessions, that we look at it again and again, and when we write about it and document it in this way, the reflections about what we've done, what worked, what didn't work, and how it worked and didn't work is a little bit more clear than it would be in a pure artistic production. And the whole process also takes a lot more time, obviously. Then it's not about just making it work as if that was a just. It's also about figuring out how it works. So, and also in terms of documentation, like an insight that I made for myself when developing software, writing the documentation of what the software actually is sometimes make me realize that I hadn't implemented what I thought I had implemented. So the documentation is actually a kind of debugging process too. So one of the things that we have implemented in this project is an analyzer that looks at an acoustic signal or any kind of audio signal and extracts a lot of features. And basically I threw in everything I was able to implement, not knowing what was useful, because we haven't done so much. There's not so many examples of these kind of performance to be had. So we just started looking at these signals, figuring out what was perhaps the more useful ones. And so far, for us, these features are perhaps the most performatively expressive features, that we can ask a musician to do more of that, brighter or more noisy or more staccato, faster. And we also have some, I would say, a little bit experimental rhythmic analysis features where we try to analyze rhythm without basing the analysis on finding a pulse and meter, because a lot of the music that we play is not in a regular meter, which makes it really hard to talk about rhythmic analysis at all. But we have some things that will be demonstrated in the first performance also, I hope. Well, these signals go from the analyzer via open zone control, send to another module, and these modules are made as VST plugins, so they can be used in any DAW. Boldly said, it works best in Reaper, to be honest. We send open zone control from one plugin to another plugin, and there we can add different features. We can take the difference between features. So if one musician is playing loud and the other is playing soft, we get a lot of output from the difference function. We can use this one signal to gate another signal and then sample and hold. And also, to be honest, the most thing that we have done is taking one signal and using that signal to control one parameter. We haven't done much of this fancy routing yet, but there's a lot. I mean, there's room for a lot of further development or experimentation there. The technology allows that kind of use, at least. So these modules output MIDI or open sound control, which then can be routed to any control in a DAW. So any parameter that you can control in a music production can be controlled by these feature extraction methods. Did I hear some murmuring questions? No. We'll get you talking. We'll get you talking. So this analyzer modulator regime allows us the freedom to map any feature to any destination parameter. So I mean, then the big question is, what are the useful mappings? So if I play really fast and I add, I don't know, crazy distortion to the drums, would that make sense musically? Or if I let the tempo of the drums control the reverb size for the vocals, then faster playing would be more muddy vocal sound, which might not be productive in at least not as a traditional way of treating things in a mix. But then again, since we can do anything, we can do counterproductive things and see where that leads us. So keeping in mind that these techniques are, in automatic mixing, for example, they are used to solve problems, but maybe here we are using them to create new problems and then see how we can work around them to create something different. So in addition to the analyzer, modulator way of working, we have other kinds of signal interaction possible. It's the traditional side chaining, of course, but we also can think of effects that take two audio signals in and do some kind of cross synthesis or cross modulation directly using those two audio signals, which means that we don't have any choice anymore. We have the full audio signal coming in here and the full audio signal coming in here, which is a much more complex modulator. Could be harder to control. As we've seen it up until now, when we use these dual input kind of effects, it's actually much easier for the performers to act on this, because the relationship to the full extent of your sound is something that we are good at as performers, but isolating single features like the pitch or the noisiness might actually be less intuitive for a musician in the shaping of the sound. So one of the dual input effects that we have done is convolution, and as we will hear more about later today, also convolution has been a process where you have to prepare an impulse response of a room in advance and load it into your reverb convolver engine. But now we have developed techniques, several techniques in fact, to allow us to update the impulse response and then be very dynamic and playful with live convolutions, so that the one signal is directly convolved with another with no preparation. You just push a pedal and there you go. We'll hear more examples of this also shortly. So some of the performative issues that could arise in this kind of playing, I mean, some of the questions, how does it really change the musical interaction? How does it change the way we think about the other one when we're playing together? And what's the extent of my instrument when my actions is influencing another musician's sound? And how does it influence the need to hear what I myself is doing in relation to what the other ones are doing? Maybe I want to hear actually the rest of the band louder than myself now. Also, many of our musicians have expressed that it might be difficult to actually work intentionally with these techniques because I have to play what I hear, some say. Well, we all say that, don't we? But what do we hear? I mean, how do we expect, how do we train ourselves to foresee or hear the effect that we might have on another instrument? So maybe there's another kind of ear training we need to work on as well. And as we heard in this video, the guitar player said, I feel like I'm a MIDI controller. So I don't pay attention to what I'm actually playing. I pay more attention to what effect it has on another. And lastly, how can we practice on this? Because there is no way to practice alone in the rehearsal room on an instrument that has this kind of extensions. Well, I hope we get more insights. I mean, we have a lot of presenters also that will look more into these questions during these 2 days. In this project, we have some resources. We have the blog that we've seen an example of already. All the code for the plugins are on GitHub, so anyone can, it's open source, anyone can download and compile them, and probably need to ask me for help to make it work, but it's research quality software. Also the live convolvers, 2 different plugins that we made are also available in a separate repository on GitHub. So that's actually my introduction to the project. Does anyone have immediate feedback or comments, please?
Hello. First of all, thanks for doing this project. Find it really interesting field to see some new development. I was thinking a little bit about how you presented the initial idea to eliminate the computer musician and have the instruments do all the knob twiddling, so to say. But then you present all these issues with how you should play, that you maybe listen more to all the other stuff that's happening than yourself, and all this. And I was just wondering if you have thought about thinking of it kind of the other way. Being a computer musician myself, I've been working a lot with the more traditional methods like sidechaining, filters, and gates, and compressors, and so on. And also just mapping amplitude to different parameters from other musicians. And what I think would be a really interesting way to use it would be to extract all this different data, but then like piping it into a computer setup with a live musician, controlling how much all of these parameters controls different things in real time, and being able to select amounts and what kind of parameters and so on, and use it more as like an instrument in itself instead of just as a tool to affect the other musicians.
Yeah, good. That's a good additional input, and I think that would be really exciting. One reason we haven't done that yet is that, at least for me, I feel that I don't really understand these interactions between the signal and the timbral output yet, so we have simplified it to be one setting for a whole piece. We have also discussed if there would be a need to transform the types of interaction during one piece, but so far we have been more than occupied enough to try to make it work in a static fashion. So that means the mapping is static. What affects what else? Good. More questions? Yeah. Could you send a mic?
Yeah, hi, Øyvind. Sort of relates to the first half of that question. I'm curious about where the original idea came from, and whether it built in part on Verfai's paper that you mentioned, or whether you found the connection to that paper much later.
Actually, we found the connection to that paper later. This grew out of our work with live processing, and when we discussed this in our whole team, our researcher is here at NTNU, we figured, well, we've explored live processing, so what more could we do? How could we take this one step further? And then after that, we realized that, people have been working on this for some time, so which is a great help to see, and also helps us narrow in like our the unexplored territory. Yeah. Please pass the mic. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Øyvind. I'm Victor. Now, my question is completely different from the previous ones. It's just the final slide there was very interesting because you touched on how to practice, and that is an obvious question. You know, how are you going to introduce that in the say if you have a you have a the teaching of various techniques of improvisation and so on, how you could introduce that type of scenario within that. So what kind of educational aspect for the performance part of it you can do, but also for the computer musician, for the person who maybe is doing something that is more on the compositional side. How much this, what are the things that we need to put in a curriculum for them to learn so that they can start engaging with these ideas. I know there's a lot of it which is very new, but a lot of it is also based on established ideas and so on. So I think an outcome of this project would be interesting would be to see, how we could inform the curriculum of music technology. And if you have any thoughts on that, that's my question.
Yeah. I think that it will be exciting to see how we can explore that, and maybe the different kinds of music technology education will tackle that a little bit differently, because some of the courses and some of the universities working with music technology are very technical. Some are more based on the practical use of technology, so it's musicians using a little bit of technology, or engineers developing stuff, or engineers researching unknown stuff. So maybe there's also a difference in how much of each component, because there's a lot to learn if you want to learn the signal processing, because maybe for the performer it makes sense to know about the maths that go into the signal processing, to understand how what I do can affect the modulation. And then, connecting that together with the performative knowledge and the day-to-day rehearsing the same thing. I don't know if it's even possible to combine in one single persons, but maybe we should create teams. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's another question.
I'm Ada. I have a kind of an observation or answer to you. The guy behind you, I don't remember your name, sorry. And about one person controlling kind of the process. Because when I was doing this live with a drummer and a viola and my own vocals, I had a lot of feedback issues, and that it would just kind of explode. So then I was kind of forced to take that role as calibrating the sensitivity and such, and I don't know, I kind of had to control it. But for me personally, it was really cool when it kind of was, what can I say, a machine doing its own work. I don't know, just an observation.
Yeah, and let me also add that Ada, back in 2016, as a bachelor student, was one of the first ones to do this live, even before we teachers did it for real. So you're a pioneer of our research here before our work in the project actually started. So your experiences about the difficulties and the challenges of doing it live, it must have been like being dropped into deep water.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope to get much more discussion and comments going, but let's now take a few minutes so we can prepare for a performance that will happen at 10 in 10 minutes, and hopefully you will have a lot more questions after that. Let me just say, we had planned for Stian Westerhus to play guitar together with Maja, Ratkje. He called in at 4 this morning and said he was ill. So we are so lucky that we have more proficient musicians around. So Miller Puckette agreed to play guitar in this session. And as you can understand, this is with a stand-in, it's not prepared in the same way. So we'll do a pedagogical build-up and show you what we're doing, whilst Miller also will get to know what we are doing. So it's not it will not be a performance like a official concert and this is a finished product, but it'll be a production demo. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Back to normal, yes. Da, 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 da.
So that's and that's the No, det ligger. Det ligger. Det var. Nei, det ligger.
Da.
Så men la oss bare prøve. So one roll. Yeah. Also see him. Right. And then you're actually convolving with me, Miller. So and actually add some dry signal for you. So yeah. Skal vi starte med det? Nei da, vi tar den først. Sånn, da er vi faktisk Yeah, we're ready to continue. So please find your seats. Yeah. So as I explained before the break, we have a stand-in for. This is our Stian Westerhus for today, Miller Puckette. Which also reminds me to say that I am so grateful for you two to be here and to all the performers in the project, because we put all these performers in a really uncomfortable situation. Like Maja said yesterday, well, you take my comfort zone and just and they are willingly entering into this, helping us to experiment with it, and being videotaped and recorded, not for internal purposes, but things that we actually publish and make available. So it's an immense contribution that we get from these performers. We're so happy. So now we will try to analyze some features of the guitar to control some features on the vocals, and vice versa. Let's see what is the most easy thing to show. We'll do the vocals modulating the guitar. So the guitar can have two different types of effects here. And this is a pitch shifter, but it's a granular based pitch shifter, so it's actually more like a tremolo, where every other wave of the tremolo is pitch shifted a little bit. And the tone to noise balance of Maja's voice controls the balance between this effect and another effect. Right. So whenever she's making something noisy, it goes to this choppy effect, and when she's making notes, long notes, then it's more nice pitch shifty. I'll let you two experiment a little bit so that you get familiar with it and you get to know how to hear it. Great. Thank you. Then we'll also do two different things on the vocals, and I'll demonstrate them each separately. One is like a time stretcher that we can add to the vocals, and it will react to very regular rhythmic playing. So if Miller is playing a steady beat, then it stretches a lot. And if you're playing something very irregular, then it's less of a time stretch. That's one thing. We also have a filter on the vocals. So when Miller plays staccato, the filter is wide open. When it plays legato, the cutoff goes down and distortion is added. Try to be even more staccato. Yeah. So, if you are interested in following these signals, you can see up here, these two reflect the staccato legato of Miller's playing. So one goes up when the other one goes down. You can try playing staccato even shorter, like. And this one goes up, and if you play legato, this one goes up. So, and further down here, it's the tone to noise balance for Maja. Here. Right? And this one is the opposite of that. This one is actually the rhythmic playing for Miller. So very rhythmic playing makes it go down, yeah. It's a little bit flaky, but maybe, but let's say, yeah. So at least if you play ta-dum, 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 and it goes up, and then da ga 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 ga. Yeah, it keeps missing some beats, but yeah, you get the general idea. Yeah. Right. Okay, so let's turn all of this on and see how they cope with it. Thank you. Now, I hope we have some questions. Or comments.
I'm Trond. Just a small question for the performers. How do you navigate within sort of a setting like this? How much do you feel in control over the different parameters, or do you think about the control at all after it has gone some time, or how do you navigate? I know it's an open question, but just some general thoughts about it.
I'd say it puts you in a state of constant conflict, because you want always to react to what is happening in your environment. I mean, what you're doing as a player is you're mostly listening to what everything else is doing. But then, if you react musically to that, then it's very, very hard to think in advance about how that natural musical reaction then is going to bounce back. To me, it's an extension of what happens when players play together, even without electronics. If they're free improvising, you can't, no one can control what happens. And this is, in a way, actually deepening that situation, because now, rather than two players, there really are four players.
Yeah, we have been touching these issues in other meetings as well.
Yeah.
And I must say, after having done this now for a while over this project, it gets more and more familiar.
Yep.
So I believe it's possible to practice this way of playing and to get to a point where you feel that you are in control of it. I can't say that I am there yet, but I'm as a player with electronics, which I normally do, and I'm used to being in many levels of the music at the same time. So that thought isn't new, but to have a more like integrated interaction with other players who are controlling the way I'm using the electronics, that is new, and I find it very exciting, because as I said to Øyvind, it pushes you somewhere else where you sometimes don't want to be, and that can also create something interesting and something new. And you need that after 20 years of playing.
Yeah,
you
of course,
need
of course, of course. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
One other comment about that, just about that question, is that it's not going to be the case that everything that you prepared is going to happen, right?
Exactly.
In other words, I don't know, but perhaps only 2/3 of the things that Øyvind set up actually ever really happened this particular time through. But that's fine, because the other things are still there in their potentiality in some way.
My question was sort of covered by Trond, but I think it's interesting this point that you bring up, when the technology is not actually a tool to achieve something very specific, but it's more a destabilizing force somehow. And I think you can also hear that in the kind of musical results that have been produced. I haven't heard all the stuff that's on the blog, but still, there is a lot of searching, not only for materials, but for ways to interact in different combinations. And I think it's for now. I think it's a very promising situation, because you actually have to negotiate in a different way than you normally do as an ensemble. So I think there's a potential in that.
I think one thing that's really interesting when you listen to it and watch it is the how much the sound of one performer is being copied to the other one, or if they are very different worlds. And I think that could also maybe be a thing that could be interesting to just have one control over, maybe even just like one expression pedal in the middle of you, so that if one person is doing something very like smooth and floaty, for example, if the other one wants to do the same, then it would make sense to be able to kind of just tap into that. If you want to end up on kind of like established parts, but then be able to go the very other way if you want to go very contrasty or chaotic.
So it's the communion to disturbance switch.
Exactly. How much peace and how much war.
Yeah.
For an interesting society.
When Øyvind and I started to play together, we quickly found a need for that, because I didn't want him to process everything that I did. I want half of it to be clean. So then we established a pedal between us where I could control what was going to his gear. So I wanted to be in charge of that. and then you have to sort of stretch out from that zone also. But we have a pedal for the convolution, which could perhaps work like that you can actually save a mood and then add layers by processing through convolution and doing other things on top of that.
And just a short comment as well, or question. Like, when you're playing, do you feel that the outcome, or do you feel that you can steer the boat, so to say, to like, let's go in this direction? Or do you feel that you do something and then something else happen and you have to react to that, but that affects you, and then, so it's hard to like, okay, I want to go this direction or this direction?
Yeah. Shall I answer first? In general, it's harder to steer the boat by doing this. It really depends on what kind of processing you are doing. With some effects, it's much harder and much easier with other ones, obviously. And it also really depends if you know each other musically. Like for example, we never met before, so we are trying to find out about how to play together at the same time as trying to find out how this works. But if I play with Siv, the drummer, which I also have a band with Øyvind, a trio, then you get past that, and then you can start working with this, directly. Then you have already established the musical language together. So the question is yes and no, depending on what context you have.
Thank you.
Yeah. And in fact, that's very much an aesthetic choice that you might want to make, whether you want to have classical kinds of form where for instance large shapes might exist, or whether you want everything to be essentially moment form a la Stockhausen, which is much more what's going on here. It literally prevents you from building things. It makes you constantly change direction.
Okay. My name is Vegard. I'm a second-year student, and I just thought of sort of a term for what is going on when you're doing this kind of creative process. Would you agree that maybe a creative feedback loop might be an applicable term for what's happening?
Yeah, I'd say an unstable creative feedback loop. At the back.
Hi, I'm Magnus. I was just thinking, how essential is it that there are 2 or more musicians playing together, as compared to, say, a single musician both doing the vocals and the guitar, for example.
Yeah, I know that you have tested with musicians who are playing and singing at the same time, for example. It's much harder to have to have these split personalities when you are doing the same with another instrument also. But I think it should be possible. Yeah.
In some of the sessions we did in San Diego last winter, we collaborated with Jordan Morton, and she's a singer and double bass player. So she modulated, her voice modulated the bass sound, and the bass modulated her voice sound. But I think for her it was easier than to use pre-composed material, because improvising 2 voices and caring about how they affect each other is like a big chunk of attention to be had. And these comments about the shapeability of longer structures is really fruitful also to the further development, because it would be, as you said, you could have a switch in to what degree you want interruption or communion, but it gives me food for thought to speculate about how we could develop that. The pedal in between us on the floor maybe are really effective, but not, I mean, maybe we could do it in different ways as well. Try to make it reactive to the kind of playing, perhaps.
Maybe I am mapping. If I look at you, then you process me.
Yeah, this is also pleasurable in the kind of mixing or production stage, that you kind of, if you, for example, have vocals and the synth, which are in layers, then you can also kind of process yourself in that stage, not necessarily live, and then I think it works really well. You can get results that you wouldn't have gotten if you were only like using a fader or something. So yes, you can also use it like that.
Absolutely, and that reminds me about one like a rehearsal trick that at least I have found when testing these things and developing them and trying to understand them. So making something not cross-adaptive but auto-adaptive, so whatever I do affects my own sound, is a way of experimenting in the rehearsal room to figure out how are my actions influencing the modulators. So it's a way of practicing alone, and you always know that the other input will make a sound, because if I'm modulating Miller's guitar and he's not playing, it's like, okay, it's harder.
I'm Maja. Just to come back to this question of the communion and disturbance sort of parameter, I also had to think on what you wrote on the blog about reactive inertia, which kind of seems related, in that you have to design a system where you can actually choose to do one or the other, or go the other direction and react to what's happening. I don't know. So instead of having like a direct control that controls that, maybe it's part of the design that you allow for this kind of reaction to be possible.
Yeah, so you're both talking about implementing some automatic routine to balance the communion disturbance axis?
Just to design sort of the interactions in a way that you can actually, you have this choice to either stay sort of in a similar kind of sonic landscape, or sort of disturb it and go in another direction. So I guess it's a bit more on a meta level, on the design level, to keep these options in mind.
Yeah, but it would go, it's a good idea to try to design, let's call them modulation vectors, that some of the available choices would be opposing, and some of them would be communal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I actually, which also ties back to what you just said before I asked the question. It's like, what happens when there's no signal from one of the musicians? Like, what happens to the effect? If Miller isn't playing, what is going on with the effect on the voice? Does that go back to, like, is it still at the last value of the parameters, or does it go back to some kind of stable value? What happens then? Like,
You'd like to know, yeah. Actually, it varies between the different feature extraction techniques. So, let's say if we extract pitch, we can gate that easily. So when the instrument is silent, we keep the last pitch, because there's no. I don't think there's a reasonable answer as to objectively what else would we do. But then one thing that I have struggled with over a long time, and again the last few days, is analyzing staccato legato balance. So it's easy to say that if we're playing staccato, you have peaks, so it's like a crest factor of the audio of the envelope. So peaks that exceed the general level means that it's probably a staccato playing, and if it's really flat, then it's legato. But when you go silent, it's actually very flat, so that means that silence is legato. So if you're playing staccato and then go silent, it sort of falls back. So that's a tricky one.
So you maybe have to combine it with overall volume.
Yeah, and maybe have some gate switching, and yeah, there are. For some of the features, I've started implementing such things, but it's the hardest part is actually figuring out what makes sense to do. And if I implement everything that could make sense, there's so many choices that we never get to use them, so we don't really evaluate what we have done. So it's better to implement fewer things maybe.
Yeah, so sort of built on a few of those ideas. I quite like the idea of thinking of this as a creative feedback loop, because when you think about feedback loops, to continue that analogy, there's usually a strength to the feedback where it goes from stable to unstable behavior, which suggests that maybe just a more subtle use of the cross-adaptive effects will give performers sufficient control that they feel it's stable and they can direct the creativity rather than having the system guide them. Have you found that to be the case, that there's a sort of a threshold in the strength, and have you investigated that?
Is that for me?
For you,
yeah.
but also, well, I'm interested what anybody thinks about this idea of sort of a, stable versus unstable creative feedback loop.
Yeah, very briefly, we have, in the project, we have had different scenarios of more subtle and more dramatic changes. And I know, for example, Bernt's work in Oslo has been in establishing more traditional effects and using compressors and controlling like more subtle nuances. So we have worked in different areas, but there's no, we haven't done so much that it's we have answers to these questions.
This is maybe a point where the feedback analogy breaks down, is this, that humans can actually choose to simply ignore what's coming out of the speakers and do what they're doing. So anytime things get completely out of control in terms of the sound, intelligent players will simply stop reacting to that and start reacting to each other, and simply allow the sound to be whatever it is. And then when that becomes too easy, then you can go back to reacting to the sound. So in some ways, the situations may be auto-correcting.
tone.
Can I just comment on that first?
No, no.
It's also a question of having control of your own sound. So we have tried different scenarios here where we also include some of the direct sound, because if you can't make any sound with your instrument at all unless I'm doing something, then you don't have that option. You don't have that possibility. If you play the theremin, or then it's impossible. So we also have to find a level where you can work, where you have. If you want to choose, if you want to have your direct signal there always. It can be a bit weird to look at the singer, for example, making a lot of sound when you don't hear anything. So for a concert situation, it could be useful to have some of the direct signal. We are doing that now when we are processing. We have a little bit of direct signal always, so there is never quiet and you see someone doing, because that, for me, that is very unmusical. I want to have many layers in music, but I want to have a direct correspondence to what you see when someone is making a sound in a moment also.
Hi, I'm just coming to what you were asking about, because from my experience working with this as a performer, I seek, it's interesting because you talk about what is, what's the word, or anyway, what's a kind of natural way of relating to the effect, what's a natural connection, between amplitude and, and what you're asking about or talking about is, from my experience, I always seek to find what is, to find a room. Okay, now this is working like this, and how can I work with that? So I agree about the disturbance thought and things making you do other things, but in that play, I also, as a musician, I want to find control rooms in a way. So to me, it's a lot of feedback. To me, it's what you're talking about is what for me, it's like what I naturally seek as a musician. I want to find workspace, which is, of course, new, but still something I can connect to with my musical intuition. So I think it's, and there is a difference between how you set it up as to how easy it is to find those places. But if you work long enough with one kind of setup, you will start to work on strategies, I think.
It's interesting because the points that you're both making are, on the one hand, it gives you tremendous amount of freedom, more ways to interact, but it appears like it can be overwhelming. So one way to get around that is essentially practice and finding the connections there, and so that's something you're all familiar with. But it's almost like a dichotomy. You had that slide early on, Øyvind, you can never have too much freedom. And there's almost a sense like I have so much freedom that it's taking control of me rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and I was, it was meant ironically. That's
Hi, Gary. This is really as an extension of a point that you made earlier, Øyvind, but also builds on something Josh said. So when are we being adaptive and when are we being cross-adaptive, and how much do we need to adapt to be cross-adaptive? Relating that to my own practice, I'm a mix engineer. I'm continually adapting things to make them work cross-adaptively. So really that's more of a reflection, and I wondered what you felt about that.
I think it might be a big question. How? But I think that you are right in saying that musicians already do this. So in an acoustic chamber ensemble, they will, violins will tune to make the first violin sound good. And Björnar in a Lemur ensemble knows a lot about the acoustic interactions and how they adapt to each other like that. So maybe that's sort of the reflection you're also making, is it? Yeah. So even though now, yeah, we have, I am so happy to have these comments and reflections, and we will take 2 more, and we'll do another little demonstration before the time for the next session. So let's take two more comments.
Thank you. I'm Joel. I'm a student here at school. You were talking earlier about having 2 sounds from one musician, a bass player and a vocalist, controlling herself. Have you tried having one of those sounds not actually sounding live, but still controlling the bass, for example? Have you tried that?
We haven't tried it. It's a good idea. Thank you.
Yeah. Oops. Thank you. I'm Carl, and I'm happy to be participating in parts of this project. This is very much about mapping. And now you, Øyvind, were mapping parameters and that the musicians were related to. I just wonder, have you through your various experiments discovered some patterns of how musicians react on specific mappings? I mean, are there certain mappings that work in a certain sense better, and other mappings they don't work at all? Have you discovered some rules related to that?
I have discovered sort of things that might work better, but I'm really hesitant to draw conclusions at this. Yeah, I think both Maja and Miller may have comments on this.
I can tell you about a bad example. Just came to my mind. I was going to change something in the sound with pitch, and then I had to go to make high pitches in the music where I didn't want high pitches at all, like you know, like so jumping out of the context. Perhaps interesting, but it made me really mad. I said to Øyvind, okay, let's do something else. So I think we have to try that would be also very different from performer to performer. To try out what works with the performers. And pitch is perhaps more difficult than other things because pitch is so important, a musical parameter. So that changes so much if you mess up with that.
It's just natural in the arts that 9/10 of the things you try don't work. You should just get used to it.
Okay, so since we talked about we have talked about a lot about the analyzer modulator kind of interaction, now we want to show you a little bit of the live convolution to sort of see how all the qualities of one sound can affect the qualities of another. And I think maybe the clearest ways to describe it, to show it, is that I'll be standing in as a vocalist, and if Miller now plays something on the guitar, while he keeps that pedal down, we should have something happening, but we don't. So? Okay. Okay, the reason is that I don't have any guitar in. Oh, yeah. My fault. convolve with that sound. So that makes like this full interactions possible. We'll do that, and of course, Miller has a lot of power there in deciding what goes into this convolution process. We'll do the same with Maja. So when Maja records something, and this is my little homemade instrument, which is a taxophone, you might call it. Record something else. And when we tested this, Maja found it so fun to have both the vocals and the taxophone. So we'll do that. Great. If you have questions about this convolution technique, remember them, and we'll come back to that later, and also the performative aspects of it. So for now, I see we're on time for the next session, but I think we deserve like 7 minutes break before, so to allow Trond and Bernt time to set up and get some air. See you in 7 minutes.
Da, 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 da. Yes. Okay. So, I think we'll just start again. We'll have a session now with two of the groups that has gone into this process. Me and Bernt has been given the responsibility to look into some experiences we have had so far. So these are two groups, one working in Trondheim and one in Oslo. Bernt will say more about that afterwards. So it's just to make sure we're part of the same project, so it's of the big cross-adaptive family. So we have gone into different aspects of this, used different working methods. And we'll have some short presentation first of how our experiences has been, what we have done, and then open up for discussions after that. So, try to make it as simple as possible. So, this is the keywords we got from Øyvind for explaining what we have done until now. It's been, for me, quite a challenging process, as some of you have already mentioned, because it's a lot of new technology. It goes into the interaction between musicians. It's improvised music. There's a lot of obstacles in getting into it in the right way as well. What we have done here in Trondheim is that we have had 5 sessions so far. I've been lucky enough to work with different musicians. We have had some session with the jazz musicians in ensemble practice, actually. So we have borrowed a lot of musicians from the jazz section here, which I've had 4 sessions with. Also had a session with the members of the Tiant ensemble, and also have had a session with pre-composed piece for 2 percussionists. So it's been quite a challenge, to be honest, but really inspiring in many ways. So I don't have any answers yet. It's too early in the process, but at least we can just throw out some of the things that we are thinking about at this point in the project. First of all, I want to say a little bit about how we have gone into it here in Trondheim. It's really dependent on the background that's already mentioned with the Tiant ensemble, working with live electronics and the experience we have gained from doing that. For me personally, going into this project, I needed to always have a musical motivation for going into technology. So the musical motivation for me has been sort of the guiding point through all this process. As is. We have done all the sessions, or most of the sessions, in studio. which means that we have had quite controlled environments. We have had good listening conditions for everyone, and we have had some time to control the sound. So for instance, when we do things live, which has already been mentioned, it's a lot of other issues coming in the way. We have tried to keep, for all the sessions, shared listening experience, meaning that everyone hears the same sound. We have listened through headphones, meaning that we have been separated from, or the musicians has been separated from the direct sound of their instruments in some way, in order to try to obtain sort of the same listening experience. For the system, I have used Reaper for analyzing the audio inputs, and then I have mapped the information in Ableton Live. And the reason for that is that in order to act as quickly as I can in those situations, I needed to just use a program that is already my instrument in a way, which makes it easier to navigate fast when you are in a session, and you can make, if you have ideas, you can change things very quickly. So that's the choice that was made there. The approach has been very different if it's for doing it with the students or with the Tiant ensemble, and we had to do this quite pedagogically because most of the students from the jazz department haven't worked with live electronics before, so we needed to try to find a method that got us into know what we were doing. So it was quite a gradual process. So the method we used for inviting the musicians into this project was to first of all doing normal live processing with me as a processing musicians, and then just try out different effects and see what the musicians responded to, in order to find a mutual sort of musical motivation in the sound, see how they react to the different effects, how they navigate within it, what made musical meaning for them and not. So we actually started with the sound itself before starting mapping it. And since we're started with doing it as a live improvisation, live electronics setting, you do movements along the way following the musicians and everything, and that could say something about the analysis methods which we then used to control the different effects, and what kind of analysis would be most natural to use, but then always measured up to the effect in a way. So we used a lot of time to try to find some musical mutual understanding when working with this. Another thing with that is that there were a lot of students, so it was quite quick changeovers. I've also used some time in getting into the technology as well, so it's been quite intense in that way. The changeover of the musicians actually was a bit strange, because normally when we worked in pairs with 2 and 2 musicians, and when we already had put up a setting and an instrument where you were able to do this, and then you changed the instrument and you left the settings, even though the same effects were there, the same analysis parameters were there, the same amount of control, changing musicians and changing instruments just flips around everything because it's improvised. So it's hard to say at this point what the effect will initially guide a musical direction, or we have some sort of some ideas, but it was a good observation. So that's with the TIAMP ensemble, we have worked with live electronics before, so it was a bit easier to start going into the technology and starting straight away naturally. So then we tried out different analysis parameters at the same time, which is more complex to do in an interplay, or more unnatural to do in an interaction situation. So rhythm and dynamics, volume control, things like that is quite natural to do in a musical situation, which made it easier to follow with your instruments, and other analysis parameters are more difficult to control, as Maja mentioned, for instance, with pitch and everything. So that's where we're at. That's already said. This is I don't have any answers to these questions, but it's just a summary of what we have observed so far. Improvised versus composed. Sometimes when you put up a system like that, it's like thinking it in a compositional way, because you put up a system that you think will guide the musicians in a certain way of playing and guide them against a certain goal. It's not like that always, but at least when you're putting up a system, you can put in use this system to put some guidelines of how the musical output will turn out. What happened when we worked with a pre-composed piece? That was really difficult, because there were classical musicians who has done this piece several times. It was a rhythmical piece, and I found myself in a more like a post-production situation, more than that the system was actually introducing something new to the piece, because they concentrated on how to do this piece. They have done it several times before, and it was hard to introduce something new into it in that way. There are some questions there. Also, since working in the studio environment, there's not, of course, not necessarily any connection between the sound you want of an instrument and the sound of the instrument you want for doing the analysis. That could be two different things as well. So there you go. And also what we found is that if the system is put up beforehand, is that a lot of the time the musical intentions from the performers doesn't fit with what the effects does, in a way. So if you are in a situation where you collectively decide to go in one direction, the effects doesn't necessarily build upon what you are trying to achieve musically, which of course can be good or bad in an improvised setting, but at least that's one of the things. And also, less is more, more is more in a different way in this sort of context, is that normally if you play an instrument and you put more energy into it, you normally want to have more of something. But in this setting, it's often that you want less of something. So if you're controlling a reverb, for instance, and you play really loud, you want the reverb to dry up, not to get more reverb on another performer, for instance. So the mapping following inverse or not is also something to take into consideration. Then you have the control versus non-control over what you are doing. For me, it feels natural to go in to try to control something first and then try to let go, but in this situation, you can't say that in general, because that depends from musician to musician if you want control over what you're doing or not. So it's hard to say something in general about that, but at least my approach in this first stage of the project is trying to get control, or at least of the technology, in order to provide a good framework for the different settings. One thing that's already been mentioned is that we need to practice a lot, and even though we use the same setup with the same musicians, it sounds differently every time you do it in improvised settings. So it's how do you perform, or how do you prepare to practice in this sort of situation? What is a good way to try to narrow down what you're trying to figure out? is it the effects that are doing the music, or is it the playing that are doing the music? Because what my findings using the same effects over and over again is that you get significantly different result every time you set it up again. So that's very open, and hope probably you have some more questions and thoughts about this. So that's a short introduction of what we have done in Trondheim so far, and everything is put on the blog, as you already said, documented and everything. So yeah. Bernt.
Ja, du kan. Du har mikken. Yeah.
My name is this on? Yes, it is on. My name is Bjørn Habbestad. I was invited into this project by Øyvind and Giri and Bernt Isak to come as an external musician and see how meeting the technology sort of from outside the development of the project would work. So my background is as a performer, improviser, sound artist. I have been working in parallel with acoustic music and electroacoustic music, and we'll share this presentation of our work process. So I'll just start by mapping the very early stages. So of course, coming into this project, I knew about what the technology was supposed to do for us on a sort of superficial level, but I didn't have any technical insights per se. So as we started working, one of the first things that we started discussing when the system was up and running was what is it that we are extracting? Which features are we interested in, and what kind of music is it that we're making in the first place? So trying to approach this situation of what's going on in the analysis, we chose to build not from a universal overarching view of the totality of music, but starting from what was the constituent components of our own musical languages. So not necessarily in terms of distinct cliches, but in terms of what were the typical musical contributions that I would bring into an improvised situation, what were Giri's repertoire and what was Bernt Isak's. And we of course noticed straight away that what we can analyze from these different situations were very, very different. So the need for adapting the analysis to the musical situation was sort of the starting point. And I think we spent at least the 2 first sessions just doing that. The first session was really just about figuring out how we could understand this approach. So we spent a lot of time on honing the analysis and much less time on tweaking the processing. So we went for a strategy where we used simple effects, meaning reverbs, compression, filters, but trying to spend as much time as we could on adapting the relationship between different kinds of musical material and their analysis.
Yeah, so our approach was complex mappings and simple processing. So we have a lot of, we ended up having a lot of quite of different analysis parameters, controlling quite simple effects, but controlling several parameters. So to make it more kind of feeling multidimensional instead of this. Sometimes if you set up simple mappings, it feels like it's jumping in between two, like it could be either or, kind of feels like binary in a way. So we're trying to avoid that by having it more complex. And also just to start back in terms of the roles of this project, initially it was me and Gyri that was set up to be kind of responsible technicians and musicians, and yeah, we weren't really sure of how to divide the roles, but we ended up having a much more democratic process and spending most of the time discussing between the three of us. Also, all three of us being performers used to using live electronics, which I think is important in this pattern, in this case. And as Bjørnar said, we ended up creating the mappings and the setup or this instrument from our individual musical personality. So that's a bespoke instrument, isn't it, Bjørnar?
Bespoke, yeah. We found a new word.
A new English word.
The reason was that we were kind of struggling, I think, with how to perform with it. Why are we doing this?
Or we couldn't understand the technical. We couldn't understand the spectral analysis really mathematical or technically. So this was a way for us to think of it musically instead of technically. Instead of thinking, oh, I should play some more spectral crest to do something. It's easier to see, okay, what happens with spectral crest when I'm playing, when Gyri is doing
if I say
pure tones or noisy asses.
What happens when I say ch, and what happens to his sound when I say that? So we got really like nerdy analytical. That's why we spent the 2 first sessions talking and making simple sounds to see what happens.
Yeah. So you can see here we had 4 different example sounds for Gyri's vocals, pure tones. Maybe you can demonstrate to them.
Yes, I can demonstrate.
So
like
pure tones, and then you have noisy S's.
I do this a lot, you know. It's kind of also analyzes your own improvisation. Can be a bit confronting sometimes.
And then you have noisy tones. And short percussive sounds.
Yeah.
And then we plotted this in the analyzer to see where did kind of in between spectral flatness, flux, and crest, where did it end up? And in the first analysis round, we just did the rough region, and then we found out, okay, some of them are really, really dense and others are more spread out. So we added this kind of spread parameters to say something about how consequent, I guess, this parameter is, depending on what it's possible to map it to. And so we did the same for flute. Can you sing your...
It's a bit hard to demonstrate.
And for guitar.
And we have some overlapping kind of sounds, but we have also, like when Bjørnar do multiphonics, that's some vocalists can do that, I know, but I cannot. If you're an overtone singer, so he kind of added some other parameters that I cannot make, which is good because flute and vocal sometimes is a bit, what should we say? Difficult. Difficult interaction, especially using the convolver. That's another story. But it's interesting because we used the convolver, and whatever I did, Bjørnar got strange reverb and strange EQ. So we had to kind of work on our sound materials as well.
And from these analysis parameters, we were able to set up mappings, and then that could be based on our musical gestures or intentions rather than the technical analysis parameters. So this has been updated several times, or the representation of it, to account for the. So we started with a more simple setup and have kind of gradually expanded. So here we have, and we just noted quite recently that our original form didn't take into account the scaling of things, the time, like the attack and the decay of the response, which is something we kind of tuned by ear in the studio, but we didn't note them in the blog post when we set up there. So as you see, there's quite a lot of mappings. These are all on the left side, flute analysis going to vocal processing and guitar processing. And we have the same for guitar going to flute processing and vocal processing. And the same for vocal analysis going to flute processing and guitar processing. So it's kind of complex, but you can see from some of a bit of the scaling here and the kind of type of effects that it's not super intrusive effects. So it's a lot of filtering, compression, reverb, delay, and it's not the processing is quite transparent, and it's sometimes, most of the time it's mixed in, so not to kill the sound totally.
I'll just add one. I noted in this process, at this stage, one of the things that we did a lot was to play a sound, a sort of a sample sound, and stare at the bouncing parameters in the plugin window. Just a very interesting exercise. And one of the things that I remember thinking of at the time was, it would be great to have the ability to record the control data, so that we could, of course you can record a sound and play it back several times and see how it affects the process. But it would also be really good to have a way to record the control input on the plugin and just instantly loop it and play it back and see how that particular sound influences the analysis. We also got sort of very stiff neck issues from separating the different parameters on a little laptop screen. So that's another thing. Am I looking at this parameter or that parameter? Or no. Yeah, well, there's all these issues with cables, and I don't know if you have experience with that, but some sound cards don't like it when you know shove your machine around.
We also got the idea of quite early on that it would be nice to have to be able to set up this system in different states, because even though we liked how it responded and that it responded to us naturally in a very musical way, it still felt a bit like we're kind of hitting walls and bouncing back all the time. And I think in terms of what Trond said, that you're kind of making a composition when you set up this setup, even though it behaves differently. So being able to, on some sort of macro level, being able to switch in between different states of the system, that to add in some sort of kind of conductor musical control or something.
I would just say something about the listening condition, because that's interesting, because we also used headphones, so that we only, because in the start we didn't. So it was like, what's happening? I don't know. I'm not sure. What is he doing when I'm doing this? And so we had a headset on, which was super, because then we could really hear what happened. But then when you get to the live situation, which is what you actually are supposed to do, it's it's a bit difficult, because you know, you have your direct signal and you have to have his direct signal, and the flute is also, you know, it's a high instrument. So it's kind of, you have a lot of, no, what? I don't know what you're saying. So I have a lot of direct signal from Bjørnar if I'm next to him. So it's kind of, I have to stretch my ears out to listen to the processing. And of course, when you are used to work with live electronics, you have this kind of multi-layered listening levels anyway, but it's, and sometimes you also, at least I get confused when I play live. Is this my sound, or is this his sound or her sound? So this is kind of a familiar listening situation as well. But now you cannot check it with the volume knob. Is it my sound? No, I don't know. So it's kind of it's an interesting rehearsal of listening in a live situation, which we have a way to go, I think, on that.
Yeah, we need to practice more.
We need to practice more.
But when you start playing it, you kind of just have to trust that the system is behaving as it should be.
Yeah.
And in terms of the interplay, I would say that I don't think we've been able to come to the level where we can have this duality. And Maja spoke about it a bit earlier. This way of, if you do a musical gesture, is it for to think about it both as a auditory musical input in the collective sound of the group, but also as a kind of a control signal to affect the other part of the group. And being able to have those two thoughts in the head at the same time, it's very difficult. But I think, at least for our system, since it's based on our musical personalities, it feels like it's kind of like a Skynet system that responds to musically to what we're doing and naturally. So it's kind of behaving according to our signatures, which is good.
I think one of the challenges that has been brought up by both the questions earlier today and also all the presentators before us is this relationship between freedom and control. And there's a sociological cliche about structure and agency in societies. And if we're a very small, very particular niche society on stage here now, the three of us, I think what was really important was that we together devised the structuring element of the project. If it had been Bernt Isak who would have made all the selections, which parameters to analyze, and if he had been responsible for devising the mapping on his own, if that wasn't a communal process, I think that the level of structure imposed by the technology would have been felt much more stronger. By doing this in a sort of flat way, not necessarily practically, because the whole thing resides on Bernt Isak's machine, but still that the process of making all the selections was a group effort. I think that was really important in order to sort of ground the technology in the group and also ground the group in the technology somehow.
We're gonna try to wrap up and make for discussion. I just want to quickly mention that we've done three sessions where we did this analysis, extraction, feature extraction, map to processing parameters, but we also did one session using the live convolver, which for us felt a bit like sidetracking, like that we were it felt very differently from the other one. And it was also very difficult because, I mean, convolving flute and vocals and guitar, it's awful. It's almost impossible to make it sound good. So, yeah, we weren't really happy the first hours there. It was almost a mutiny, but we managed to pull through. But I think, like, the one thing that we got out of it and discovered from it is that we felt that there's a difference between kind of technical or signal-based cross-adaptiveness, where you have two signals coming in, and a musical cross-adaptiveness. Because for the live convolver, it didn't really start feeling playable until we added 2 live convolvers. So that's, for instance, Bjørnar's flute was convolved through Gyrid, and Gyrid was convolved to Bjørnar. And being able to have some parameter control on that. So maybe there's 2 different kinds of cross-adaptiveness.
Then we felt we could play like musically, not making our instrument sound bad.
No, because I think in the way that convolver was set up is that it kind of it gives much more power to one side, and by setting up 2, it made it easier to. Even though, as Øyvind said, you're pushing all the buttons at the same time. So.
Yes, we did. So
sorry,
we can blame ourselves.
Buttons are so fun. All right, I think that's what we have now, and maybe the other group can come down. And
yes,
we can have a discussion.
Do you want to join in?
So,
yeah, I guess we have experienced a lot of the same issues when we're working with this. I just found one thing that forgot to mention when we worked in the studio and with the bleeding between microphones. And this means that in some situations, and especially in a live situation, you don't only control the effects, so you actually self-adapting at the same time, because you got the bleeding between microphones as well, which comes into play. So I don't know if how you come to that.
We definitely had that. I mean, we were working in a rather small studio, and when we didn't work with headsets, even if we were spaced far apart, of course, there was bleed. Putting up headsets and working that, of course, helps for that. I think in a way this challenge relates to some of the points that Maja pointed out earlier, and also that you mentioned about the ability to control which parts or how much of your acoustic signal are you processing. And the signal that you want to present to the PA as a representation of your sound is not necessarily the signal that you would want to present to the analysis. So, and I mean, this is of course for any sort of processing situation, having a setup which allows you to distinguish between massaging the sound for analysis as one separate thing, and massaging the sound for acoustic presentation or electronic presentation as another. So I think that level of nuance or finesse needs to be addressed somehow, but I don't think it's a fault of the technology. It just means that when we implement these things, we need to take that into account when we're implementing the system somehow.
Yeah, and I think the work you have done with analyzing the different sounds would be a good starting point for that, because that says something about if you, for instance, use a double set of microphones, that if you're going to get one of those things out of it, it's a sort of two-way of working. So you work musical, or what you hear in one way and how you listen in the analysis in a different way sometimes.
Because when I work live alone, I always use 2 mics. Yeah. So one for the clean signal and one with a bunch of stuff. So because then if it crashes, I have sound, which is a good thing. No, but if it crashes, when it crashes, no, it hasn't actually. But it's of course an important issue, because you have to have this double mind of the direct signal and the processed and what it does to the others. So, but it's fun.
And actually that touches, I mean, something that we discovered or that we experienced in a lot of sessions, and that's the kind of, despite that you have control through your acoustical signal, there's a lot of the musicians have expressed a wish to have some kind of control on top of that. A wish for a switch or for a second mic or something that they could feel that, okay, something will happen each and every time I do this, so they can kind of feel and master the situation better, perhaps.
I think that ties into the same area as the different states of the system that we set in, so that you can turn on and off different states, or you can interpolate between them. And I think it would at least extend the possibilities of the system. So that it might be too much if you have everything enabled at the same time. But there can be different interesting ways to go. And also just to comment on the clean sound, we also ended up at first we just had processed sound, and then after a while we ended up mixing in a bit of clean signal to make it more. But it wasn't. I don't think it was really because we were lost musically, but it was more kind of a production-wise choice that it wasn't. It became a nicer mix if we had some acoustic sounds in there. Though it was fun when the low pass filter went all the way down and you couldn't hear Gyrid, but her sound was still going into the analyzer, so she was still affecting the sound of Bjørnar's flute. So I mean, it can also be fun to take it to the extremes like this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for people working with live electronics, I think that level of alienation from your instrument is known. Our experience was that, of course, working with a lot of people that haven't worked with live electronics before, we needed to have some sort of direct sound from the instrument, because if not, you take away all the control, and then you take away the musical modulation sometimes. So you need to feel a bit in control, at least the first times. But one observation there, it's just a thought, is that as soon as you introduce the direct sound of the instrument, you're most of the time I'm actually chasing the established convention for how that instrument should sound like, in a way. Which sort of effects do you put on top of it? As soon as you have the direct sound, you are in a way stuck within that room, in a way, if that makes sense. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think for us, this was natural because the kind of effects that we chose were more sort of a production layer on top of the acoustic signal. None of the processes that we ran were very destructive to the input. Maybe apart from the very big filter, which just pushes your co-musician off stage, so to speak. But I think that was a conscious decision in the beginning. I don't know if it was well informed or not, but it was just something that we decided to see if we could create a situation where we were manipulating the soundscape of our different instruments in a way somebody who would have done a live remix would do. Just then with spatial equalizing, compressing tools. And if we had gone for granulation or yeah, we had some ring modulation, but still, if we had done more sort of more intervening processing, I think that the question on direct signal would have been very different.
Yeah, definitely, and there's another interesting point which I think come in the same area, and that's the definition of roles in an interplay. So actually, if you set up a system, you can make someone do something subtle, and you can make someone do something radical on the other side, and that sort of sets up a different situation than in a sort of democratic interplay situation. I don't know if you tried that.
Should we have a dynamic about it?
It's a dynamic microphone.
Okay. I think our different backgrounds was contributing to that, both positively and negatively, in the way that Bernt Isak ended up with the poor role of having the system on his Mac, which sort of leaves him with the maintenance situation. So there is imbalance and hierarchy implied with technology always. I mean, we cannot escape that. I mean, we can have the idea or the ideal of being democratic, but anyone who knows what it is to maintain a system knows that the other people don't know. So in this project, I was in the lucky position of having a very long stick, saying like, yeah.
we could poke him if he wasn't
yes,
satisfied.
I want more of that.
But I can say something about this because the good thing was that we all have this experience about of doing live electronics, so we could have really like good discussions about the aesthetics about it. Which also, of course, could be a bad thing, because I can say, no, you're not pitch shifting my voice, and not do that. You're not allowed to. So if he was the technician saying, just, you're gonna sing, I'm gonna pitch shift you, so please shut up. Because then I can choose my favorite effects, which all my students know is filtering, reverb, and equalization. No, but it's like using the kind of traditional, what can you get out of it, without overdoing the signal processing, kind of. Not overdoing it, but like not destroying it or whatever. We had some ring modulation on you, so I was able to pitch shift you, because when we were kind of getting into tonal things, we could go out of it by ring modulating you. Yes.
Though ring modulation is kind of quite destructive,
yes.
But I think maybe the clue here is that it's still coherent with the musical gesture. It doesn't add part. Even the delays we used had quite short delay times. So and there's problems sometimes with a lot of like harmonization, granular stuff. It adds on a long tail, so it makes the sound much bigger and last longer, while we kept our quite short, and that makes the whole system a bit more snappy and more easy to respond, and here kind of the cause and effects doesn't break down as much.
I think one of the experiences that I had from this project is sort of the importance when you're improvising with an electronic processing, that you don't separate between your music and the music of the system, but you need to actually take the whole electroacoustic chain into account as a musician. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sort of visualize or conceptualize what's going on in FFT analysis while you're shaping the cavity of your mouth, but actually thinking of the whole process chain, from your acoustic sound, the microphone, the sound card, the analyzer, the plugins, the speaker setup, as one system that you are interacting with. And this, of course, must have been really difficult to explain to someone who drops into a studio and says, what does this microphone do?
But I want to go back to a thing that Gyrid said about well, her preferences, and that was surely something that we experienced in our many sessions with different musicians, because there were a lot of different preferences, what types of processing that they felt was appropriate or that they kind of could work with musically. One vocalist wouldn't want processing of her voice that sounded unnatural or digital, whereas another one thought that was super cool. And so it's a lot about aesthetics preferences, and also the kind of the terrain that you're used to and you feel familiar with as a musician. So we certainly experienced that there were huge differences in the different terrains that the musicians felt comfortable with. But for some, the feeling of discomfort also was a goal in itself. But for most of them, they kind of longed to some safe place up in all the chaos.
Me and Trond have talked a bit about before how much you had experienced that everything changed all the time. Like it felt like every time was you started from scratch every time, and I guess it's a big difference between the way you've been working with a lot of students, a lot of different inputs, new people, and short time to set up. While we have been lucky enough to be the same small group working over with the same instruments in the same place over a long time, working on the same system, and I think it gets much easier to navigate when you have time to practice and fine tune it. Weirdly enough.
Yeah, definitely, and that's also my experience with working with Karl Håkon and Tone, where we sort of know each other musically already, and we can go further into the possibilities in many ways, exploring other things.
I just said to Tone before we got up here that this freedom thought, because I thought I was so free, I can do everything. I have no limits. But doing this project, I really found out that yes, I'm not so free. I have really like strict aesthetic thoughts about how things should be, how we should use effects, and with this not sounding natural, this subtle use of effects, which is stronger in me than I thought. So this was kind of the confronting project, and some sounds I just don't want to do. You know, it's like really interesting. No, I'm not doing that. No, I'm keeping it low.
How are we on time? And should we open for some questions before we finish off? I mean, we still have like 40 minutes.
Ah, all right.
Whoa,
okay,
really?
but then before
Okay.
opening up for questions, it's just a small question from me to Bernt, because it's been for me as processing musician in this setting up, a lot of the energy has been put into setting up the systems from time to time, and it's not until now I have had the chance to actually put musical interaction with my own instrument into the system, and it's quite, at least my experience is that it's, as we probably all know, it's quite hard to flip between the technician view on it and then do a performance on it afterwards, because you have thoughts all over the place. At the end, when everything's working and things sounds nice, you are not able to interact in a good way, you know, because you use all your energy for putting things up. Another thing in the prolonging of that is that for a session we didn't have time with the performers to listen back to what we have heard, because we had a discussion directly after we have played, and that's almost always a different opinion when you play it yourself and you perform yourself, or when you go back and listen to it afterwards, and then not in headphones but on speakers, and go more analytic about it.
Yeah, to start with the last one, we did that when we started setting up and testing to play together. We recorded it and immediately listened back afterwards and analyzed and talked together. So, oh yeah, I can hear something happening here, and this is working, and yeah, just doing reflection and analysis of the performing, and also in terms of as if I understood correctly, you in the beginning you were just doing processing and not playing yourself. Yeah. So for us, we decided, since we had kind of both me and Gyri was originally intended to be like have your position and then change back and forth. And in this startup democratic process structure that we chose, we felt like, okay, we have to be performing as well, because we have to, it's easier to control the system if you know how the system reacts as a musician as well. So we kind of put ourselves into the situation as performing musicians and technicians, which made it took much more time and divided focus, and I would have done a much better job both as a musician and technician if I concentrated on both. But I think it was beneficial to the outcome, that it's and it made it our process instead of my process with them as attendants. So it's yeah.
And also been working as technicians for like how many hours? 4 hours. Frustrating, things not working, and then when it worked, then we could really like play like, oh yes, with super much energy, because we have all this kind of energy that playing energy that we wanted to get out the whole day.
Yeah.
So that was quite fun when we played for like in half an hour, and it was like, wow.
And I guess also for those, not only for me setting it up, but also for Gyrid and Bjørnar, and also Mats, who was having the same role as Andreas, the observer. I think it's very boring to sit around waiting for someone to fuff around with technicalities and punch things, and it's not working.
What you say, Mats?
And I'm not saying you had a great time, but but at least if you understand what's going on, if you understand why it's taking so long, since you're part of the process, it's you have more patience. I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. We know what you are doing and trying to do, and
you feel the pain.
We feel your pain when Reaper doesn't do what you want.
Or live is crashing.
Or live is crashing. Yes. No, but of course it's very important, because working with musicians that like, oh, what are you doing sitting in your machine? I want to play, you know. It's like we can just be a mental support.
So how was it when you changed back from just being a technician to being? How do you feel the transition with the role? Can you say, you spoke a bit about it, but it would be interesting to hear more about how the role changed.
It started out. It was actually, we had a more democratic process than I'm putting out here, because the first thing to invite someone who hasn't worked with live electronics before into this project was to give them a visual feedback of what we actually do with the sound, so that they could watch a screen and see when they do a musical gesture, that they see how it's read and how it's analyzed, and how my playing is affecting it in a way. And made decision out of that in many ways, and then also with the effects, and how you chose how to put up the effect was also part of that sort of discussion. But what we would, as I told before, it was important to start with the sound first, so that they found a space where they felt comfortably in, and then going into the control aspect of it afterwards. I think, of course, I've tried it as a musician, self-adapting what we are doing here. So I'm not unfamiliar with it, but it's sort of the state when you concentrate on being compositional. You know, putting up a system that will lead someone, or hopefully lead someone in some sort of musical direction. Depending on which effects you choose, or and what to control, which instrumentation you have, and so on. And going from that sort of thought over to doing improvised music is, yeah, we probably should have some more breaks between.
More coffee.
Yeah.
Maybe the role changes from, because I don't recognize really the composer view of it. So maybe when you're part of it yourself, it turns more into kind of a instrument builder. I mean, these things are crossing over, but it really felt like the same as when I'm designing any kind of other digital musical instrument, considering the same aspects and not. But if I hadn't been part of it, I'm guessing it would have been more, had a more compositional view on the process.
And it's also interesting to kind of to be an outside observer. I'm in the studio and I'm kind of in the project, but still I'm not playing, and I don't feel it the same way as you performers do it when you're kind of in it. So, but what I do feel is the need to understand what's going on, and that's something I've been kind of reflecting about. Is that something I should do as a listener? I guess that will be maybe topic of discussion tomorrow. But I've been wanting all the time to understand what's going on here, and sometimes the settings are changed and it's maybe not so clearly communicated to us in the control room, and then I'm really struggling to kind of get a grip on what's going on. So it's an effort in listening, and I'm really trying to understand what happens.
Some questions.
Thank you very much. Simon, myself and Suve will be in tomorrow morning's session, and thank you very much. You're feeding us with so many topics and rich questions to discuss then. So I thought I'd just confine myself to one, and it follows absolutely from the last remark. And it's about the bleeding of microphones, but I want to develop that a little bit, because in the video, I think one of Trond's videos, you've solved this problem in inverted commas by separating people into vocal booths and separating them out, which of course changes the social dynamic completely. And interestingly, I'm next to Gary and Josh, who are going to talk about studio techniques. It sends a message to me that the live performance is moving towards a sort of studio performance. And I'm fascinated by that. There's no right or wrong in this, we're very well aware. But it puts me in mind, and maybe we need an update from Miller, because I know Californian places have been doing a lot of work on how humans actually track what's going on. You don't worry about bleed when you're listening to the flute player across the room and singing. You have a mechanism in our perception which can filter the two psychologically. You can separate the two in your mind, the so-called cocktail party effect. You can actually focus on a particular sound, even in a completely immersive mix. So my dream situation is that's the front end to your system, that you can maintain close physical contact, but the system can filter the different instruments into their originals and then deal with them. It can't happen tomorrow, but that's the psychology of the question.
Maybe we need a cocktail party upcode in CSAN, Victor.
I think that's a very good description, and I think if we had the time to do double sound checks. First, you sound check the signal that goes into the analyzer, and you treat that as a completely separate thing from the musical sound that you're delivering out, because you treat that in the second sound check. So talk about utopias, but I think this is really also just a mental challenge to really perceive the difference between those two demands.
I guess there's some practical steps that can be taken, like for instance when Trond Engum is working with amplified sound, they have a set of specific microphones, a specific position and ready sets. They measure the resonance frequency in each instrument and dip those so that you get more gain before feedback, etc. So I guess if you did like a really good pre-production for each performer, that could help a lot. Or doing that, you don't have to have 2 sound checks, but if you do a really thorough pre-production sound check for the analyzer, maybe that could help. But that would limit it to using the same microphones and the same performers, obviously. You have some thoughts?
In one way, what we did was one very long sound check. To not to be devaluate what the musical quality of our trio, but if we were to make a spreadsheet showing the amount of time spent sound checking and the amount of time performing, we would all be sound engineers and not performers. And I think that is an investment, and I think the gain of that process, of that long sound check, that is yet to materialize, but I think it's there.
I meant machine listening separation of the sources. I know, that's why I said 5 years in California. Because I know these things are available not real time, and they're coming on real time stream soon. So I did actually mean software separation of sources. Okay. As well as your good microphone technique.
Any more questions from the audience?
For both of your groups, you mainly played with improvised music. There's only Trond that mentioned there was one pre-composed piece, but you then mentioned the piece was played before without electronics. So was the piece composed with or without electronics, and how did that influence the dynamics of the electronics compared to the modernist compositions that use electronics in them?
Yeah, I think I don't have any clear answers for this, no rights or wrongs, but it's actually my belief that to use this system in composition, you have to compose with it in mind. And you have to use the benefits, because I think if you have it on a pre-composed piece, which is intended for another use, you're just chasing conventional techniques when applying the cross-adaptive, because you just follow the sound of the instrument, and you would like to do subtle changes in the original sound of the instrument more than bringing in something new. Because even though I brought in new sounds which intentionally should take them out of the comfort zone, they still had their scores there, they had rehearsed it a lot of time. The direct sound of a percussionist is quite loud, so the headphones doesn't help too much either. Sorry. So it's my belief at this point, at least, that using this in a compositional manner needs to be to writing new material intended for that use, and that's in order, if you want the cross-adaptive to bring something new into the composition anyway.
Okay, Sigurd here. I just have a question regarding control. If you look at digital musical instruments, one concept is mapping and mapping complexity. So if you make the mapping easy, the mastering of the instrument goes very fast, but it gets boring. If you make it complex, you work very differently. You start not understanding by your head, but you start listening and trying out in a different way. So the group in Oslo, they did their work trying to learn the mappings. Spent a lot of time learning the mappings. Is there anyone who has done a similar work not knowing the mappings at all, and even using mapping that's so hard you can't really understand them? So it's sort of a complex mess that you have to sort of find a way through. As an interesting exercise, it will be a very hard learning exercise because handling a musical instrument is one person learning the instrument. In this case, there are actually two persons or more persons having to learn this instrument. But to what extent have you really gone into that frustration of not at all understanding the mapping, but still trying to make music out of it?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that because I also realized that when we worked with complex mappings in San Diego, we had more of that situation. Perhaps Miller also can comment on how that was experienced from the outside, because I had set up pretty complex mappings and not telling every detail to the musicians, but saying, well, it has to do with how fast you play and if you play staccato legato, but I didn't go into the detail of explaining all the interactions happening. But it's really different for you in Oslo because you did like the collective process of designing the whole setup. So all of you knew intimately what would happen with each and every signal.
But our goal, which is quite interesting, was to achieve a way of playing together which was close to playing without electronics, kind of. It was that was our goal, to try to make something that we could play with without thinking about the mappings and what it did. So that's a bit interesting to because that was what we tried to achieve through this 2-day sound check, actually.
Yeah, I think this, as Sigurd mentioned, it's complex mappings. It's the reason for setting it up like this, as I said initially, was to avoid this feeling of this kind of bouncing back and forth feeling, or it's kind of semi-binary, which makes it easy to decode, but to create this more complex environment where we could, even though it was kind of learned from our musical gestures, it was still kind of a landscape to explore and find out, and I think that's in DMI design, that's crucial, to have the ability to explore and practice and get better and like find new places and new sounds, and it felt like we had an instrument or collective instrument that we can do that.
I just want to say we had. I think it's very much about. I don't know if the mapping is complex or not, but my experience with the two types of convolution, which is live convolution, which you showed us here, but also this stream convolution with me and you, which was for me out of control, because I did not understand. Or even if I could understand what happened, but I couldn't understand it with my musical knowledge. It was so new. And what we're talking about here is exploring and in ways to explore. And if you think about improvisation, you can criticize improvisation for repeating what you always do. What you know, you go places you know how to work with. So I think and this system opens for both. It opens for exploring rooms where you find a kind of control and grades of control, but it also opens for going completely new places where you're out of control, and that's also a big something that when I went into this project, I thought this would be impossible to make musical meaning at all, and I was surprised that when I started to find musical meaning, but then I also realized that I really appreciate the moments where you don't intuitively get this feedback that you expect, and then because then you're really going to new places. So it has to do to what you want, how do you want to work with exploring in a way, and you can do both, I think. So it could both be kind of intuitive musical instrument, but it also can and should be something that really brings you really far out and going places you couldn't have gone without it. Anyway.
I'd just like to comment that really quickly, and I don't think there are any rights or wrongs, and the way that you approach and work with technology will be very person dependent. But for my own sake, being very much aware of how we devised the system in the beginning and being very preoccupied with tuning the analysis is a very different thing than playing with that system. Meaning that although I am informed by having done that tuning process, I don't think that knowledge is directly activated when we're playing in it. Of course, there's also a leaking in that respect, but at least I observed myself having sort of parts of my cognition thinking about how, what kind of effect is my material producing on Gyri or Bernt Isak. But then this phases out and I focus on the totality of the sound or my relationship to the totality of the sound, and then it slowly comes back again and I start to reflect and it fades. So I think these I think there are many ways of engaging with this level of structure that the system imposes on you, and I don't think that one approach is more valid than the other in a way.
And you switch between as you go along.
Yeah, hi, Christopher for the 10th time. Did you ever try to play with effects on the instruments? Because, yeah, for example, the electric guitar, if you strum it and you have a fuzz pedal on or you have a tremolo pedal on, the output is very different. And I found that a lot of musicians who have been working with electronics for a while feel that their instrument is not just, yeah, let's for example say the guitar. It's the guitar combined with the effects. That's the actual instrument, and that's your expression. And I was just wondering if you did take that into consideration, or maybe not yet.
Yes, both things. As a guitar player, it's a great instrument to do in a live electronic situation because it's a hybrid instrument. It doesn't make a lot of direct sound, which is good for a lot of reasons. A guitarist normally likes to control its own effects in many ways. So it's in one way a lot of gaining control in that situation, and it's an extension of your instruments. You know, it's a normal practice in any genre. So to process something that's already processed is kind of quite messy in many ways, but interesting, of course. But what the possibility is for the electric guitar is, of course, we spoke about two different microphone sets here, is that you can, even though you play with your effects on the guitar, you can use the direct sound of the guitar for analyzing and doing other sorts of processes in the background. And that comes also into what Miller told us earlier today, that you can have sounds that has a potential to go somewhere, but you don't necessarily need to go there, in a way, depending on how you play or how you mechanically treat your instrument, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Just thinking that what you physically do with the instrument and the sound that comes out of the instrument, even though it's electrical processing, maybe like For example, we tracked staccato playing here and legato playing, and but if you do that with your hand or you do it with a tremolo pedal, for example, then it would make sense that if you have on the tremolo pedal, the sound is staccato, so you would track it as a staccato, but you don't need to like physically play it like that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So you can, and it's quite easy to, yeah, keep both options open, and you can do, yeah, combinations of that, or you can, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe you just need to restrict a little bit how complex the initial processing is. Yeah.
Yes, I usually have a lot of effects after my guitar signal, so I'm not that used to hearing it coming out clean, which we decided also that early on in our 3 that to make it kind of decipherable and not too messy, as Trond said, I would just cut out all the effects. It's just the guitar straight into the sound card and a bit of massaging of the signal, some EQ and compression, but that's static. So for now, I think that was the reasonable thing to do. But of course, it's also, it takes away a lot of the instrument that I normally play, which makes it differently. Though on the positive side, it forces me to really be aware, reflect on my own input, how I interact with the guitar as an instrument, and sometimes you can, if you have a lot of effects, you can be a bit loose about what you put in. It's like, yeah, just make a sound and then you produce the output. While that might actually kind of somehow give the control over to the effect instead of your original musical intention. Though of course you can play the effect, but it has made me more conscious about how I interact with the guitar and the kind of the source sound. And then I think it would be, we already talked about that, but it would take more time to gradually start adding on the normal effects that I do have. And as you say, it's interesting to use like a square wave tremolo thing to do very staccato stuff, or take it even a step further, like eliminating acoustic instrument and bringing in a pure electronic musician. I'm not sure anyone has done that yet, but that'll be an interesting mess to watch.
Yeah, just want to add one small thing about my experiences with doing the guitar, because I've done some sessions with Øyvind where we have presented where I don't have my guitar effects with me, and I've done it both with classical and electric guitar. And for the classical guitar, it was actually quite nice, because then you have a reference in the room, and you still have some sort of place where you can hang on to. But as soon as we did the electric guitar, that was a totally different story, because you have an expectation for the electric guitar to sound in a certain way, and please give me some reverb or at least something to work with. And so it was really, really difficult. It was a tough day at work, but eventually when we tried out different things, it was actually a different way of playing, and all of your repertoire in a way disappeared, or half of the repertoire disappears when you take away the effects in it as well. So it's at least a good exercise, I guess.
Yeah, is this on? Yes. Also, comment about the question like half an hour ago about doing it a bit more subtle. Subtle is the word. Subtle. Oh yeah. When you can combine these techniques, the cross-adaptive techniques, with like what you said, normal processing. So you can have your processing and control those, and adaptiveness can control like the parameters inside the effect. So kind of you don't have to go all in, you know. Yeah.
think that's true, and I think you can scale the level of influence that the cross-adaptiveness has on the playing situation. So that is really just a question of how you implement the effect that the system will produce, and not sort of specifically signal processing effect, but what is the role of answering the question of what is the role of the processing system? It's sort of the first thing you do. Is this supposed to be a framework that controls the people that are in it, or is it an extension of what they do? Is it something that colors or casts a new perspective on what's taking place? You can make these decisions and implement, very subtle processing or extremely in systems that completely take the agency of the musician apart. So this is, I don't think it's an either or situation at all.
My name is Hans from the first year. Are there any plans for including larger ensembles and the sum signal of one large ensemble, like a string section competing with a brass section? Has this been done, or like an entire orchestra? Sorry for the word, but fucking up each other.
What you say, Øyvind?
No, the question is, has this been done?
No, not in, I don't think so. No, no, no.
No, no.
No,
Just
it's a good idea.
There are some immediate implications. I mean, you could of course use this system to generate real-time spectral music. If you put up, as you say, a string section and a brass section, you could use this to sort of recreate the kind of musical effects that Gérard Grézet does in Partiel or any of these late 70s pieces. I would say just go for it. And record it.
Yeah, and I think this also leads back to the question you answered, Trond. Should a piece be composed with the system, or could you transfer a composition in a way? And your conclusion was that it should be composed with the system, but I think that depends on how you relate to the composition. So if you could view the composition as something that, as you say, can be changed or transferred, or I think there should, or what do you think about that? If you have a kind of open view to what the composition can become, or are you allowed to touch it?
I agree that it could be. It's not that it shouldn't be not be composed for the composed, but I think it's, if you have something that's already there, I think you're endangering of following the conventions of what is expected from the piece from before. So that's my point.
And we actually thought the live convolver is a good tool, or I see it as a tool I could use for composition. The thing you can freeze, to use it actively and add some control to the musician, which I think some musicians would appreciate.
I would just, I was thinking about it, but maybe the performers was the issue here as well. What do you think about that one? I mean, you're saying that they were you were trying to push them places, but they were like strictly following the score. How about if you had different performers more used to maybe both used to improvisation and working with live electronics? I don't know.
Actually, we did both. So we ended up in the improvised setting because the musicians felt uncomfortable with the situation because they were really concentrating to do what they were intended to do in a way. So and it was really brilliant percussionists from here. So it was so it could be several things. It could be the system that was set up. It could be the choosing of the effects. I think the effects probably were a bit more dramatic than was expected for that sort of piece. So, but if you have done it more subtle or followed, I think it will be easier to, you know, follow that lead, at least as a starting point. So, yeah, there's a lot of things coming into it, and it's, yeah. But it need to recompose. Yeah, you need to. That's also a possibility to look upon. So it's not. But I think if it what try to clarify my point with that you need to do it in as thinking about it when you compose is that I think you can be in danger of just following something that's in the convention instead of making it contributing to taking a new elements into it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
As a comment to that as well, it's become quite common, especially in England. I can't remember which university that recomposes classical pieces of Debussy or Schoenberg and add electronics, but often the people adding electronics, for example, do not understand the compositional parameters that the composer was writing with, and then there's these two completely separate elements of what's happening compositionally and what's happening with the electronics, which can be interesting, but also often has completely ruined good compositions. This one piano piece of Debussy that was just played with a bunch of reverb and called Recomposed, for example, which Trond showed me a few years ago. Well, if you are writing with the electronics, then the electronics become part of the poiesis of the piece and a compositional parameter compared to the inverse, where it's two completely different beasts.
I think that if we open up the coffin of musical ontology, we might actually be slightly off topic or starting for a very long detour. So I think the whole question of work aesthetics or the way that we as different musicians engage with compositions, old and new. I think that's a parallel track. What at least was really clear for us was that the context that we approached this technology within was from an improvisation-based and sort of action-oriented way of thinking. And I'm sure that there are ways to approach this technology in a compositional format. I'm convinced that could have a very interesting effects, but that has been outside the time and space and technological infrastructure available to us.
But it's a master project, you know, for some of you, to write new music for acoustic musicians and this kind of systems. Because in Canada, it's more of this, I know. So go on.
Thank you. We'll have to conclude this session, and it seems to have we have touched. I mean, there's no way of summing up what you have given us, but I see that one thing that you have talked about is the relationship with convention in different ways of instrumental sound and composition, and so that's also part of the essence that we want to touch with the project. So basically, I'll cut this short now, and we'll take 45 minutes for lunch, and be back at 1:15. And for the researchers and assistants, there will be lunch up there. Rest of you, good luck getting some. Thank you.